Section 5. A recent historical writer has described the world of that time as one that believed in established words and was invincibly blind to the obvious in things. Certainly it seems now that nothing could have been more obvious to the people of the earlier 20th century than the rapidity with which war was becoming impossible. And certainly they did not see it. They did not see it until the atomic bombs burst in their fumbling hands. Yet the broad facts must have glared upon any intelligent mind. All through the 19th and 20th centuries, the amount of energy that men were able to command was continually increasing. Applied to warfare, that meant that the power to inflict a blow, the power to destroy, was continually increasing. There was no increase whatever in the ability to escape. Every sort of passive defense, armor, fortifications, and so forth, was being outsmarted by this tremendous increase on the destructive side. Destruction was becoming so facile that any little body of malcontents could use it. It was revolutionizing the problems of police and internal rule. Before the last war began, it was a matter of common knowledge that a man could carry about in a handbag an amount of latent energy sufficient to wreck half a city. These facts were before the minds of everybody. The children in the streets knew them. And yet the world still, as the Americans used to phrase it, fooled around with the paraphernalia and pretensions of war. It is only by realizing this profound, this fantastic divorce between the scientific and intellectual movement on the one hand, and the world of the lawyer-politician on the other, that the men of a later time can hope to understand this preposterous state of affairs. Social organization was still in the barbaric stage. There were already great numbers of actively intelligent men and much private and commercial civilization, but the community, as a whole, was aimless, untrained, and unorganized to the pitch of imbecility. Collective civilization, the modern state, was still in the womb of the future. Section 6. But let us return to Frederick Barnet's Wanderjahr, and its account of the experiences of a common man during the wartime. While these terrific disclosures of scientific possibility were happening in Paris and Berlin, Barnet and his company were industriously entrenching themselves in Belgian Luxembourg. He tells of the mobilization and of his summer day's journey through the north of France and the Ardennes in a few vivid phrases. The country was browned by a warm summer, the trees a little touched with autumnal color, and the wheat already golden. When they stopped for an hour at Hersen, men and women with tricolor badges upon the platform distributed cakes and glasses of beer to the thirsty soldiers, and there was much cheerfulness. Such good, cool beer it was, he wrote. I had nothing to eat nor drink since Epsom. A number of monoplanes, like giant swallows, he notes, were scouting in the pink evening sky. Barnet's battalion was sent through the Sedan country to a place called Virton, and thence to a point in the woods on the line to Jamai. Here they detrained, bivouacked uneasily by the railway. Trains and stores were passing along it all night, and next morning he marched through a cold overcast dawn, and a morning, first cloudy and then blazing, over a large spacious countryside interspersed by forests towards Arlon. There the infantry were set to work upon a line of masked entrenchments and hidden rifle pits between St. Hubert and Virton, that were designed to check and delay any advance from the east upon the fortified line of the Meuse. They had their orders, and for 2 days they worked without either a sight of the enemy or any suspicion of the disaster that had abruptly decapitated the armies of Europe, and turned the west of Paris and the center of Berlin into blazing miniatures of the destruction of Pompeii. And the news, when it did come, came attenuated. We heard there had been mischief with airplanes and bombs in Paris, Barney relates, but it didn't seem to follow that they weren't still somewhere elaborating their plans and issuing orders. When the enemy began to emerge from the woods in front of us, we cheered and blazed away, and didn't trouble much more about anything but the battle in hand. If now and then one cocked up an eye into the sky to see what was happening there, the rip of a bullet soon brought one down to the horizontal again. That battle went on for 3 days all over a great stretch of country between Louvain on the north and Longwy to the south. It was essentially a rifle and infantry struggle. The airplanes did not seem to have taken any decisive share in the actual fighting for some days, though no doubt they affected the strategy from the first by preventing surprise movements. They were airplanes with atomic engines, but they were not provided with atomic bombs, which were manifestly unsuitable for field use, nor indeed had they any very effective kind of bomb. And though they maneuvered against each other, and there was rifle shooting at them and between them, there was little actual aerial fighting. Either the airmen were indisposed to fight, or the commanders on both sides preferred to reserve these machines for scouting. After a day or so of digging and scheming, Barney found himself in the forefront of a battle. He had made his section of rifle pits, chiefly along a line of deep dry ditch that gave a means of intercommunication. He had had the earth scattered over the adjacent field, and he had masked his preparations with tussocks of corn and poppy. The hostile advance came blindly and unsuspiciously across the fields below, and would have been very cruelly handled indeed, if some one away to the right had not opened fire too soon. It was a queer thrill when these fellows came into sight, he confesses, and not a bit like maneuvers. They halted for a time on the edge of the wood, and then came forward in an open line. They kept walking nearer to us and not looking at us, but away to the right of us. Even when they began to be hit, and their officers' whistles broke upon them, they didn't seem to see us. One or two halted to fire, and then they all went back towards the wood again. They went slowly at first, looking round at us. Then the shelter of the wood seemed to draw them, and they trotted. I fired rather mechanically and missed. Then I fired again, and then I became earnest to hit something, made sure of my sighting, and aimed very carefully at blue-black that was dodging about in the corn. At first I couldn't satisfy myself and didn't shoot. His movements were so spasmodic and uncertain. Then I think he came to a ditch or some such obstacle, and halted for a moment. "Got you," I whispered, and pulled the trigger. I had the strangest sensation about that man. In the first instance, when I felt that I had hit him, I was irradiated with joy and pride. I sent him spinning. He jumped and threw up his arms. Then I saw the corn tops waving and had glimpses of him flapping about. Suddenly I felt sick. I hadn't killed him. In some way he was disabled and smashed up, and yet able to struggle about. I began to think. For nearly 2 hours that Prussian was agonizing in the corn. Either he was calling out or someone was shouting to him. Then he jumped up. He seemed to try to get up upon his feet with one last effort, and then he fell like a sack, and lay quite still and never moved again. He had been unendurable, and I believe someone had shot him dead. I had been wanting to do so for some time. The enemy began sniping the rifle pits from shelters they made for themselves in the woods below. A man was hit in the pit next to Barnet, and began cursing and crying out in a violent rage. Barnet crawled along the ditch to him, and found him in great pain, covered with blood, frantic with indignation, and with the half of his right hand smashed to a pulp. "Look at this!" he kept repeating, hugging it and then extending it. "Damned foolery! Damned foolery! My right hand, sir! My right hand!" For some time Barnet could do nothing with him. The man was consumed by his tortured realization of the evil silliness of war, the realization which had come upon him in a flash, with the bullet that had destroyed his skill and use as an artificer forever. He was looking at the vestiges with a horror that made him impenetrable to any other idea. At last the poor wretch let Barnet tie up his bleeding stump, and help him along the ditch that conducted him deviously out of range. When Barnet returned, his men were already calling out for water, and all day long the line of pits suffered greatly from thirst. For food they had chocolate and bread. "At first," he says, "I was extraordinarily excited by my baptism of fire. Then as the heat of the day came on, I experienced an enormous tedium and discomfort. The flies became extremely troublesome, and my little grave of a rifle pit was invaded by ants. I could not get up or move about, for someone in the trees had got a mark on me. I kept thinking of the dead Prussian down among the corn, and of the bitter outcries of my own man. Damned foolery! It was damned foolery! But who was to blame? How had we got to this?" Early in the afternoon an airplane tried to dislodge us with dynamite bombs, but she was hit by bullets once or twice, and suddenly dived down over beyond the trees. From Holland to the Alps this day, I thought, there must be crouching and lying between 500,000 of men, trying to inflict irreparable damage upon one another. The thing is idiotic to the pitch of impossibility. It is a dream. Presently I shall wake up. Then the phrase changed itself in my mind. Presently mankind will wake up. I lay speculating just how many thousands of men there were among these hundreds of thousands. Those spirits were in rebellion against all these ancient traditions of flag and empire. Weren't we, perhaps, already in the throes of the last crisis, in that darkest moment of a nightmare's horror, before the sleeper will endure no more of it, and wakes? I don't know how my speculations ended. I think they were not so much ended as distracted by the distant thudding of the guns that were opening fire at long range upon Namur. Section 7. But as yet Barnet had seen no more than the mildest beginnings of modern warfare. So far he had taken part only in a little shooting. The bayonet attack by which the advanced line was broken was made at a place called Croix Rouge, more than 20 miles away, and that night under cover of darkness the rifle pits were abandoned, and he got his company away without further loss. His regiment fell back unpressed behind the fortified lines between Namur and Sedan, entrained at a station called Mété, and was sent northward by Antwerp and Rotterdam to Haarlem. Hence they marched into North Holland. It was only after the march into Holland that he began to realize the monstrous and catastrophic nature of the struggle in which he was playing his undistinguished part. He describes very pleasantly the journey through the hills and open land of Brabant, the repeated crossing of arms of the Rhine, and the change from the undulating scenery of Belgium to the flat, rich meadows, the sunlit dike roads, and the countless windmills of the Dutch levels. In those days there was unbroken land from Alkmaar and Leyden to the Dollard, three great provinces, South Holland, North Holland, and Zuider-Zeeland, reclaimed at various times between the early 10th century and 1945, and all many feet below the level of the waves outside the dikes, spread out their lush polders to the northern sun, and sustained a dense industrious population. An intricate web of laws and custom and tradition ensured a perpetual vigilance and a perpetual defense against the beleaguering sea. For more than 250 miles from Walcheren to Friesland stretched a line of embankments and pumping stations that was the admiration of the world. If some curious god had chosen to watch the course of events in these northern provinces while that flanking march of the British was in progress, he would have found a convenient and appropriate seat for his observation upon one of the great cumulus clouds that were drifting slowly across the blue sky during all these eventful days before the great catastrophe. For that was the quality of the weather, hot and clear, with something of a breeze, and underfoot dry and a little inclined to be dusty. This watching god would have looked down upon broad stretches of sunlit green, sunlit save for the creeping patches of shadow cast by the clouds, upon sky-reflecting meres, fringed and divided up by masses of willow and large areas of silvery weeds, upon white roads lying bare to the sun upon a tracery of blue canals. The pastures were alive with cattle, the roads had a busy traffic, of beasts and bicycles and gaily colored peasants' automobiles. The hues of the innumerable motor barges in the canal vied with the eventfulness of the roadways, and everywhere in solitary steadings, among ricks and barns, in groups by the wayside, in straggling villages, each with its fine old church, or in compact towns laced with canals and abounding in bridges and clipped trees, were human habitations. The people of this countryside were not belligerents. The interests and sympathies alike of Holland had been so divided that to the end she remained undecided and passive in the struggle of the world powers, and everywhere along the roads taken by the marching armies clustered groups and crowds of impartially observant spectators, women and children in peculiar white caps and old-fashioned sabots, and elderly, clean-shaven men quietly thoughtful over their long pipes. They had no fear of their invaders. The day when soldiering meant bands of licentious looters had long since passed away. That watcher among the clouds would have seen a great distribution of khaki-uniformed men and khaki-painted material over the whole of the sunken area of Holland. He would have marked the long trains, packed with men or piled with great guns and war material, creeping slowly, alert for train wreckers, along the north-going lines. He would have seen the Scheldt and Rhine choked with shipping, and pouring out still more men and still more material. He would have noticed halts and provisionings and detrainments, and the long bustling caterpillars of cavalry and infantry, the maggot-like wagons, the huge beetles of great guns, crawling under the poplars along the dikes and roads northward, along ways lined by the neutral, unmolested, ambiguously observant Dutch. All the barges and shipping upon the canals had been requisitioned for transport. In that clear, bright, warm weather, it would all have looked from above like some extravagant festival of animated toys. As the sun sank westward, the spectacle must have become a little indistinct because of a golden haze. Everything must have become warmer and more glowing, and because of the lengthening of the shadows more manifestly in relief. The shadows of the tall churches grew longer and longer, until they touched the horizon and mingled in the universal shadow, and then, slow and soft, and wrapping the world in fold after fold of deepening blue, came the night at first obscurely simple, and then with faint points here and there, and then jeweled in darkening splendor with 100,000 lights. Out of that mingling of darkness and ambiguous glares, the noise of an unceasing activity would have arisen, the louder and plainer now because there was no longer any distraction of sight. It may be that watcher drifting in the pellucid gulf beneath the stars watched all through the night. It may be that he dozed, but if he gave way to so natural a proclivity, assuredly on the fourth night of the great flank march he was aroused, for that was the night of the battle in the air that decided the fate of Holland. The aeroplanes were fighting at last, and suddenly about him, above and below, with cries and uproar rushing out of the four quarters of heaven, striking, plunging, oversetting, soaring to the zenith and dropping to the ground, they came to assail or defend the myriads below. Secretly, the Central European power had gathered his flying machines together, and now he threw them as a giant might fling a handful of 10,000 knives over the low country. And amidst that swarming flight were 5 that drove headlong for the sea walls of Holland, carrying atomic bombs. From north and west and south, the Allied aeroplanes rose in response and swept down upon this sudden attack. So it was that war in the air began. Men rode upon the whirlwind that night and slew and fell like archangels. The sky rained heroes upon the astonished earth. Surely the last fights of mankind were the best. What was the heavy pounding of your Homeric swordsmen? What was the creaking charge of chariots, beside this swift rush, this crash, this giddy triumph, this headlong swoop to death? And then athwart this whirling rush of aerial duels, that swooped and locked and dropped in the void between the lamplights and the stars, came a great wind and a crash louder than thunder, and first one and then a score of lengthening fiery serpents plunged hungrily down upon the Dutchman's dikes and struck between land and sea, and flared up again in enormous columns of glare and crimson smoke and steam. And out of the darkness leapt the little land, with its spires and trees, aghast with terror, still and distinct, and the sea, tumbled with anger, red foaming like a sea of blood. Over the populous country below went a strange multitudinous crying and flurry of alarm bells. The surviving aeroplanes turned about and fled out of the sky, like things that suddenly know themselves to be wicked. Through a dozen thunderously flaming gaps that no water might quench, the waves came roaring in upon the land. "We had cursed our luck," says Barnet, "that we could not get to our quarters at Alkmaar that night. There, we were told, were provisions, tobacco, and everything for which we craved. But the main canal from Zaandam and Amsterdam was hopelessly jammed with craft, and we were glad of a chance opening that enabled us to get out of the main column and lie up in a kind of little harbor very much neglected and weed-grown before a deserted house. We broke into this and found some herrings in a barrel, a heap of cheeses, and stone bottles of gin in the cellar, and with this I cheered my starving men. We made fires and toasted the cheese and grilled our herrings. None of us had slept for nearly 40 hours, and I determined to stay in this refuge until dawn, and then if the traffic was still choked, leave the barge and march the rest of the way into Alkmaar. This place we had got into was perhaps 100 yards from the canal and underneath a little brick bridge, we could see the flotilla still, and hear the voices of the soldiers. Presently 5 or 6 other barges came through and lay up in the mere near by us, and with 2 of these, full of men of the Antrim regiment, I shared my find of provisions. In return we got tobacco. A large expanse of water spread to the westward of us, and beyond were a cluster of roofs and 1 or 2 church towers. The barge was rather cramped for so many men, and I let several squads, 30 or 40 perhaps altogether, bivouac on the blank. I did not let them go into the house on account of the furniture, and I left a note of indebtedness for the food we had taken. We were particularly glad of our tobacco and fires, because of the numerous mosquitoes that rose about us. The gate of the house from which we had provisioned ourselves was adorned with the legend, Vrugde big vrede, joy with peace, and it bore every mark of the busy retirement of a comfort-loving proprietor. I went along his garden, which was gay and delightful with big bushes of rose and sweetbrier, to a quaint little summer house, and there I sat and watched the men in groups cooking and squatting along the bank. The sun was setting in a nearly cloudless sky. For the last 2 weeks I had been a wholly occupied man, intent only upon obeying the orders that came down to me. All through this time I had been working to the very limit of my mental and physical faculties, and my only moments of rest had been devoted to snatches of sleep. Now came this rare, unexpected interlude, and I could look detachedly upon what I was doing, and feel something of its infinite wonderfulness. I was irradiated with affection for the men of my company, and with admiration at their cheerful acquiescence in the subordination and needs of our positions. I watched their proceedings and heard their pleasant voices. How willing those men were! How ready to accept leadership and forget themselves in collective ends! I thought how manfully they had gone through all the strains and toil of the last 2 weeks, how they had toughened and shaken down to comradeship together, and how much sweetness there is, after all, in our foolish human blood. For they were just one casual sample of the species. Their patience and readiness lay, as the energy of the atom had lain, still waiting to be properly utilized. Again it came to me with overpowering force that the supreme need of our race is leading, that the supreme task is to discover leading, to forget oneself in realizing the collective purpose of the race. Once more I saw life plain. Very characteristic is that of the rather too corpulent young officer, who was afterwards to set it all down in the Wanderjahr. Very characteristic, too, it is of the change in men's hearts that was even then preparing a new phase of human history. He goes on to write of the escape from individuality in science and service, and of his discovery of this salvation. All that was then, no doubt, very moving and original. Now it seems only the most obvious commonplace of human life. The glow of the sunset faded, the twilight deepened into night, the fires burnt the brighter, and some Irishmen away across the mere started singing, but Barnet's men were too weary for that sort of thing, and soon the bank and the barge were heaped with sleeping forms. I alone seemed unable to sleep. I suppose I was over-weary, and after a little feverish slumber by the tiller of the barge I sat up, awake and uneasy. That night Holland seemed all sky. There was just a little black lower rim to things, a steeple, perhaps, or a line of poplars, and then the great hemisphere swept over us. As at first the sky was empty, yet my uneasiness referred itself in some vague way to the sky. And now I was melancholy. I found something strangely sorrowful and submissive in the sleepers all about me, those men who had marched so far, who had left all the established texture of their lives behind them, to come upon this mad campaign, This campaign that signified nothing and consumed everything, this mere fever of fighting. I saw how little and feeble is the life of man, a thing of chances, preposterously unable to find the will to realize even the most timid of its dreams. And I wondered if always it would be so, if man was a doomed animal who would never to the last days of his time take hold of fate and change it to his will. Always, it may be, he will remain kindly but jealous, desirous but discursive, able and unwisely impulsive, until Saturn who begot him shall devour him in his turn. I was roused from these thoughts by the sudden realization of the presence of a squadron of airplanes, far away to the northeast and very high. They looked like little black dashes against the midnight blue. I remember that I looked up at them at first rather idly, as one might notice a flight of birds. Then I perceived that they were only the extreme wing of a giant fleet that was advancing in a long line very swiftly from the direction of the frontier, and my attention tightened. Directly I saw that fleet I was astonished not to have seen it before. I stood up softly, undesirous of disturbing my companions, but with my heart beating now rather more rapidly with surprise and excitement. I strained my ears for any sound of guns along our front. Almost instinctively I turned about for protection to the south and west, and peered, and then I saw coming as fast and much nearer to me, as if they had sprung out of the darkness, 3 banks of aeroplanes, a group of squadrons very high, a main body at a height perhaps of 1,000 or 2,000 feet, and a doubtful number flying low and very indistinct. The middle ones were so thick they kept putting out groups of stars, and I realized that after all there was to be fighting in the air. There was something extraordinarily strange in this swift, noiseless convergence of nearly invisible combatants above the sleeping hosts. Every one about me was still unconscious. There was no sign as yet of any agitation among the shipping on the main canal, whose whole course, dotted with unsuspicious lights and fringed with fires, must have been clearly perceptible from above. Then a long way off towards Alkmaar I heard bugles, and after that shots, and then a wild clamour of bells. I determined to let my men sleep on for as long as they could. The battle was joined with the swiftness of dreaming. I do not think it can have been 5 minutes from the moment when I first became aware of the Central European air fleet to the contact of the 2 forces. I saw it quite plainly in silhouette against the luminous blue of the northern sky. The Allied aeroplanes, they were mostly French, came pouring down like a fierce shower upon the middle of the Central European fleet. They looked exactly like a coarser sort of rain. There was a crackling sound, the first sound I heard. It reminded one of the aurora borealis, and I supposed it was an interchange of rifle shots. There were flashes like summer lightning, and then all the sky became a whirling confusion of battle that was still largely noiseless. Some of the Central European aeroplanes were certainly charged and overset. Others seemed to collapse and fall and then flare out with so bright a light that it took the edge off one's vision and made the rest of the battle disappear as though it had been snatched back out of sight. And then, while I still peered and tried to shake these flames from my eyes with my hand, and while the men about me were beginning to stir, the atomic bombs were thrown at the dikes. They made a mighty thunder in the air, and fell like Lucifer in the picture, leaving a flaring trail in the sky. The night, which had been pellucid and detailed and eventful, seemed to vanish, to be replaced abruptly by a black background to these tremendous pillars of fire. Hard upon the sound of them came a roaring wind, and the sky was filled with flickering lightnings and rushing clouds. There was something discontinuous in this impact. At one moment I was a lonely watcher in a sleeping world. The next saw everyone about me afoot, the whole world awake and amazed. And then the wind had struck me a buffet, taken my helmet and swept aside the summer house of Vrugda Big Vrede, as a scythe sweeps away grass. I saw the bombs fall, and then watched a great crimson flare leap responsive to each impact, and mountainous masses of red-lit steam and flying fragments clamber up towards the zenith. Against the glare I saw the countryside for miles standing black and clear, churches, trees, chimneys. And suddenly I understood. The Central Europeans had burst the dikes. Those flares meant the bursting of the dikes, and in a little while the sea-water would be upon us. He goes on to tell with a certain prolixity of the steps he took, and all things considered they were very intelligent steps, to meet this amazing crisis. He got his men aboard and hailed the adjacent barges. He got the man who acted as barge engineer at his post and the engines working. He cast loose from his moorings. Then he besought himself of food, and contrived to land 5 men, get in a few dozen cheeses, and ship his men again before the inundation reached them. He is reasonably proud of this piece of coolness. His idea was to take the wave head-on and with his engines full speed ahead, and all the while he was thanking heaven he was not in the jam of traffic in the main canal. He rather, I think, overestimated the probable rush of waters. He dreaded being swept away, he explains, and smashed against houses and trees. He does not give any estimate of the time it took between the bursting of the dikes and the arrival of the waters, but it was probably an interval of about 20 minutes or half an hour. He was working now in darkness, save for the light of his lantern, and in a great wind. He hung out head and stern lights. Whirling torrents of steam were pouring up from the advancing waters, which had rushed, it must be remembered, through nearly incandescent gaps in the sea defences, and this vast uprush of vapor soon veiled the flaring centres of explosion altogether. The waters came at last, in advancing cascade. It was like a broad roller sweeping across the country. They came with a deep roaring sound. I had expected a Niagara, but the total fall of the front could not have been much more than 12 feet. Our barge hesitated for a moment, took a dose over her bows, and then lifted. I signaled for full speed ahead, and brought her head upstream, and held on like grim death to keep her there. There was a wind about us as strong as the flood, and I found we were pounding against every conceivable buoyant object that had been between us and the sea. The only light in the world now came from our lamps. The steam became impenetrable at a score of yards from the boat, and the roar of the wind and water cut us off from all remoter sounds. The black shining waters swirled by, coming into the light of our lamps out of an ebony blackness, and vanishing again into impenetrable black. And on the waters came shapes, came things that flashed upon us for a moment, now a half-submerged boat, now a cow, now a huge fragment of a house's timberings, now a muddle of packing cases and scaffolding. The things clapped into sight like something shown by the opening of a shutter, and then bumped shatteringly against us or rushed by us. Once I saw very clearly a man's white face. All the while a group of laboring, half-submerged trees remained ahead of us, drawing very slowly nearer. I steered a course to avoid them. They seemed to gesticulate a frantic despair against the black steam clouds behind. Once a great branch detached itself, and tore shuddering by me. We did, on the whole, make headway. The last I saw of Vrugda Big Vreda, before the night swallowed it, was almost dead astern of us. Section 9. Morning found Barnet still afloat. The bows of his barge had been badly strained, and his men were pumping or bailing in relays. He had got about a dozen half-drowned people aboard whose boat had capsized near him, and he had 3 other boats in tow. He was afloat, and somewhere between Amsterdam and Alkmaar, but he could not tell where. It was a day that was still half night. Grey waters stretched in every direction under a dark grey sky, and out of the waves rose the upper parts of houses, in many cases ruined, the tops of trees, windmills, in fact the upper third of all the familiar Dutch scenery, and on it there drifted a dimly seen flotilla of barges, small boats, many overturned, furniture, rafts, timbering, and miscellaneous objects. The drowned were under water that morning. Only here and there did a dead cow or a stiff figure still clinging stoutly to a box or chair or such like, buoy hint at the hidden massacre. It was not till the Thursday that the dead came to the surface in any quantity. The view was bounded on every side by a grey mist that closed overhead in a grey canopy. The air cleared in the afternoon, and then, far away to the west under the great banks of steam and dust, the flaming red eruption of the atomic bombs came visible across the waste of water. They showed flat and sullen through the mist, like London sunsets. "They sat upon the sea," says Barnet, "like frayed-out water-lilies of flame." Barnet seems to have spent the morning in rescue work along the track of the canal, in helping people who were adrift, in picking up derelict boats, and in taking people out of imperiled houses. He found other military barges similarly employed, and it was only as the day wore on and the immediate appeals for aid were satisfied that he thought of food and drink for his men, and what course he had better pursue. They had a little cheese, but no water. Orders, that mysterious direction, had at last altogether disappeared. He perceived he had now to act upon his own responsibility. One's sense was of a destruction so far-reaching, and of a world so altered, that it seemed foolish to go in any direction and expect to find things as they had been before the war began. I sat on the quarter-deck with Mylius my engineer, and Kemp, and 2 others of the non-commissioned officers, and we consulted upon our line of action. We were foodless and aimless. We agreed that our fighting value was extremely small, and that our first duty was to get ourselves in touch with food and instructions again. Whatever plan of campaign had directed our movements was manifestly smashed to bits. Mylius was of opinion that we could take a line westward and get back to England across the North Sea. He calculated that with such a motor barge as ours, it would be possible to reach the Yorkshire coast within 24 hours. But this idea I overruled because of the shortness of our provisions, and more particularly because of our urgent need of water. Every boat we drew near now hailed us for water. Their demands did much to exasperate our thirst. I decided that if we went away to the south we should reach hilly country, or at least country that was not submerged, and then we should be able to find land, find some stream, drink, and get supplies and news. Many of the barges adrift in the haze about us were filled with British soldiers and had floated up from the Nord Sea Canal, but none of them were any better informed than ourselves of the course of events. Orders had, in fact, vanished out of the sky. Orders made a temporary reappearance late that evening in the form of a megaphone hail from a British torpedo boat, announcing a truce, and giving the welcome information that food and water were being hurried down the Rhine, and were to be found on the barge flotilla lying over the old Rhine above Leyden. We will not follow Barnet, however, in the description of his strange overland voyage among trees and houses and churches, by Zaandam and between Haarlem and Amsterdam, to Leyden. It was a voyage in a red-lit mist, in a world of steamy silhouette, full of strange voices and perplexity, and with every other sensation dominated by a feverish thirst. We sat, he says, in a little huddled group, saying very little, and the men forward were mere knots of silent endurance. Our only continuing sound was the persistent mewing of a cat one of the men had rescued from a floating hay-rack near Zaandam. We kept a southward course by a watch-chain compass Mylius had produced. I do not think any of us felt we belonged to a defeated army, nor had we any strong sense of the war as a dominating fact about us. Our mental setting had far more of the effect of a huge natural catastrophe. The atomic bombs had dwarfed the international issues to complete insignificance. When our minds wandered from the preoccupations of our immediate needs, we speculated upon the possibility of stopping the use of these frightful explosives before the world was utterly destroyed. For to us it seemed quite plain that these bombs and the still greater power of destruction, of which they were the precursors, might quite easily shatter every relationship and institution of mankind. "What will they be doing?" asked Mylius. "What will they be doing? It's plain we've got to put an end to war. It's plain things have to be run some way. All this, is impossible." I made no immediate answer. Something, I cannot think what, had brought back to me the figure of that man I had seen wounded on the very first day of actual fighting. I saw again his angry, tearful eyes, and that poor, dripping, bloody mess that had been a skilful human hand, 5 minutes before, thrust out in indignant protest. "Damned foolery!" he had stormed and sobbed. "Damned foolery! My right hand, sir! My right hand!" My faith had for a time gone altogether out of me. "I think we are too silly," I said to Mylius, "ever to stop war. If we'd had the sense to do it, we should have done it before this. I think this—" I pointed to the gaunt black outline of the smashed windmill that stuck up, ridiculous and ugly, above the blood-lit waters. "This is the end." Section 10. But now our history must part company with Frederick Barnet and his barge load of hungry and starving men. For a time in Western Europe, at least, it was indeed as if civilization had come to a final collapse. These crowning buds upon the tradition that Napoleon planted and Bismarck watered, opened and flared like water lilies of flame over nations destroyed, over churches smashed or submerged, towns ruined, fields lost to mankind forever, and a million weltering bodies. Was this lesson enough for mankind, or would the flames of war still burn amidst the ruins? Neither Barnet nor his companions, it is clear, had any assurance in their answers to that question. Already once in the history of mankind, in America, before its discovery by the whites, an organized civilization had given way to a mere cult of warfare, specialized and cruel, and it seemed for a time to many, a thoughtful man, as if the whole world was but to repeat on a larger scale this ascendancy of the warrior, this triumph of the destructive instincts of the race. The subsequent chapters of Barnet's narrative do but supply body to this tragic possibility. He gives a series of vignettes of civilization, shattered, it seemed, almost irreparably. He found the Belgian hills swarming with refugees and desolated by cholera, the vestiges of the contending armies keeping order under a truce, without actual battles, but with the cautious hostility of habit, and a great absence of plan everywhere. Overhead aeroplanes went on mysterious errands, and there were rumors of cannibalism and hysterical fanaticisms in the valleys of the Semoy and the forest region of the eastern Ardennes. There was a report of an attack upon Russia by the Chinese and Japanese, and of some huge revolutionary outbreak in America. The weather was stormier than men had ever known it in those regions, with much thicker lightning and wild cloud-bursts of rain. End of Chapter 2. Chapter the Third. The Ending of War. Section 1. On the mountain side above the town of Brissago, and commanding two long stretches of Lake Maggiore, looking eastward to Bellinzona, and southward to Luino, there is a shelf of grass meadows, which is very beautiful in springtime, with a great multitude of wild flowers. More particularly is this so in early June, when the slender asphodel St. Bruno's lily, with its spike of white blossom, is in flower. To the westward of this delightful shelf, there is a deep and densely wooded trench, a great gulf of blue some mile or so in width, out of which arise great precipices very high and wild. Above the asphodel fields, the mountains climb in rocky slopes to solitudes of stone and sunlight, that carve round and join the wall of cliffs, in one common skyline. This desolate and austere background contrasts very vividly with the glowing serenity of the great lake below, with the spacious view of fertile hills and roads and villages and islands to the south and east, and with the hotly golden rice flats of the Val Maggia to the north. And because it was a remote and insignificant place, far away out of the crowding tragedies of that year of disaster, away from burning cities and starving multitudes, bracing and tranquilizing and hidden, it was here that there gathered the conference of rulers, that was to arrest, if possible, before it was too late, the debacle of civilization. Here, brought together by the indefatigable energy of that impassioned humanitarian, Leblanc, the French ambassador at Washington, the chief of powers of the world were to meet in a last desperate conference, to save humanity. Leblanc was one of those ingenious men, whose lot would have been insignificant in any period of security, but who have been caught up to an immortal role in history, by the sudden simplification of human affairs through some tragical crisis, to the measure of their simplicity. Such a man was Abraham Lincoln, and such was Garibaldi, and Leblanc, with his transparent childish innocence, his entire self-forgetfulness, came into this confusion of distrust and intricate disaster with an invincible appeal for the manifest sanities of the situation. His voice, when he spoke, was full of remonstrance. He was a little bald, spectacled man, inspired by that intellectual idealism which has been one of the peculiar gifts of France to humanity. He was possessed of one clear persuasion that war must end, that the only way to end war was to have but one government for mankind. He brushed aside all other considerations. At the very outbreak of the war, so soon as two capitals of the belligerents had been wrecked, he went to the President in the White House with his proposal. He made it as if it was a matter of course. He was fortunate to be in Washington and in touch with that gigantic childishness which was the characteristic of the American imagination, for the Americans also were among the simple peoples by whom the world was saved. He won over the American President and the American government to his general ideas. At any rate, they supported him sufficiently to give him a standing with the more skeptical European governments, and with this backing he set to work. It seemed the most fantastic of enterprises, to bring together all the rulers of the world and unify them. He wrote innumerable letters, he sent messages, he went on desperate journeys, he enlisted whatever support he could find. No one was too humble for an ally or too obstinate for his advances. Through the terrible autumn of the last wars this persistent little visionary in spectacles must have seemed rather like a hopeful canary twittering during a thunderstorm, and no accumulation of disasters daunted his conviction that they could be ended. For the whole world was flaring then into a monstrous phase of destruction. Power after power about the armed globe sought to anticipate attack by aggression. They went to war in a delirium of panic, in order to use their bombs first. China and Japan had assailed Russia and destroyed Moscow. The United States had attacked Japan. India was in anarchistic revolt with Delhi, a pit of fire spouting death and flame. The redoubtable king of the Balkans was mobilizing. It must have seemed plain at last to everyone in those days that the world was slipping headlong to anarchy. By the spring of 1959, from nearly 200 centers, and every week added to their number, roared the unquenchable crimson conflagrations of the atomic bombs. The flimsy fabric of the world's credit had vanished. Industry was completely disorganized in every city. Every thickly populated area was starving or trembling on the verge of starvation. Most of the capital cities of the world were burning. Millions of people had already perished, and over great areas government was at an end. Humanity had been compared by one contemporary writer to a sleeper who handles matches in his sleep and wakes to find himself in flames. For many months it was an open question whether there was to be found throughout all the race the will and intelligence to face these new conditions, and make even an attempt to arrest the downfall of the social order. For a time the war spirit defeated every effort to rally the forces of preservation and construction. Leblanc seemed to be protesting against earthquakes, and is likely to find a spirit of reason in the crater of Etna, even though the shattered official governments now clamored for peace. Bands of irreconcilables and invincible patriots, usurpers, adventurers, and political desperadoes were everywhere in possession of the simple apparatus for the disengagement of atomic energy and the initiation of new centers of destruction. The stuff exercised an irresistible fascination upon a certain type of mind. Why should anyone give in when he can still destroy his enemies? Surrender? While there is still a chance of blowing them to dust? The power of destruction, which had once been the ultimate privilege of government, was now the only power left in the world, and it was everywhere. There were few thoughtful men during that phase of blazing waste who did not pass through such moods of despair as Barnet describes, and declare with him, "This is the end." And all the while Leblanc was going to and fro with glittering glasses and an inexhaustible persuasiveness, urging the manifest reasonableness of his view upon ears that ceased presently to be inattentive. Never at any time did he betray a doubt that all this chaotic conflict would end. No nurse during a nursery uproar was ever so certain of the inevitable ultimate peace. From being treated as an amiable dreamer, he came by insensible degrees to be regarded as an extravagant possibility. Then he began to seem even practicable. The people who listened to him in 1958 with a smiling impatience were eager before 1959 was 4 months old to know just exactly what he thought might be done. He answered with the patience of a philosopher and the lucidity of a Frenchman. He began to receive responses of a more and more helpful type. He came across the Atlantic to Italy, and there he gathered in the promises for this Congress. He chose those high meadows above Brissago for the reasons we have stated. "We must get away," he said, "from old associations." He set to work requisitioning material for his conference, with an assurance that was justified by the replies. With a slight incredulity, the conference which was to begin a new order in the world gathered itself together. Leblanc summoned it without arrogance. He controlled it by virtue of an infinite humility. Men appeared upon those upland slopes with the apparatus for wireless telegraphy. Others followed with tents and provisions. A little cable was flung down to a convenient point upon the Locarno road below. Leblanc arrived, sedulously directing every detail that would affect the tone of the assembly. He might have been a courier in advance rather than the originator of the gathering. And then there arrived, some by the cable, most by aeroplane, a few in other fashions, the men who had been called together to confer upon the state of the world. It was to be a conference without a name. 9 monarchs, the presidents of 4 republics, a number of ministers and ambassadors, powerful journalists and such like prominent and influential men took part in it. There were even scientific men, and that world-famous old man, Holston, came with the others to contribute his amateur statecraft to the desperate problem of the age. Only Leblanc would have dared so to summon figureheads and powers and intelligence, or have had the courage to hope for their agreement. Section 2. And one at least of those who were called to this conference of governments came to it on foot. This was King Egbert, the young king of the most venerable kingdom in Europe. He was a rebel, and had always been of deliberate choice a rebel against the magnificence of his position. He affected long pedestrian tours, and a disposition to sleep in the open air. He came now over the pass of St. Maria Maggiore, and by boat up the lake to Brissago. Thence he walked up the mountain, a pleasant path set with oaks and sweet chestnut. For provision on the walk, for he did not want to hurry, he carried with him a pocket full of bread and cheese. A certain small retinue that was necessary to his comfort and dignity upon occasions of state he sent on by the cable car, and with him walked his private secretary, Firmin, a man who had thrown up the professorship of world politics in the London School of Sociology, Economics, and Political Science, to take up these duties. Firmin was a man of strong rather than rapid thought. He had anticipated great influence in this new position, and after some years he was still only beginning to apprehend how largely his function was to listen. Originally he had been something of a thinker upon international politics, an authority upon tariffs and strategy, and a valued contributor to various of the higher organs of public opinion. But the atomic bombs had taken him by surprise, and he had still to recover completely from his pre-atomic opinions and the silencing effect of those sustained explosives. The king's freedom from the trammels of etiquette was very complete. In theory, and he abounded in theory, his manners were purely democratic. It was by a sheer habit and inadvertency that he permitted Firmin, who had discovered a rucksack in a small shop in the town below, to carry both bottles of beer. The king had never, as a matter of fact, carried anything for himself in his life, and he had never noted that he did not do so. "We will have nobody with us," he said, "at all. We will be perfectly simple." So Firmin carried the beer. As they walked up, it was the king who made the pace rather than Firmin. They talked of the conference before them, and Firmin, with a certain want of assurance that would have surprised him in himself in the days of his professorship, sought to define the policy of his companion. "In its broader form, sir," said Firmin, I admit a certain plausibility in the project of Leblanc's, but I feel that although it may be advisable to set up some sort of general control for international affairs, a sort of Hague Court with extended powers, that is no reason whatever for losing sight of the principles of national and imperial autonomy." "Firmin," said the king, "I am going to set my brother kings a good example." Firmin intimated a curiosity that veiled a dread. "By chucking all that nonsense," said the king. He quickened his pace as Firmin, who was already a little out of breath, betrayed a disposition to reply. "I am going to chuck all that nonsense," said the king, as Firmin prepared to speak. "I am going to fly my royalty and empire on the table, and declare at once I don't mean to haggle. It's haggling, about rights, has been the devil in human affairs, for always. I am going to stop this nonsense." Firmin halted abruptly. "But, sir," he cried. The king stopped 6 yards ahead of him, and looked back at his advisor's perspiring visage. "Do you really think, Firmin, that I am here as an infernal politician to put my crown and my flag and my claims and so forth in the way of peace? That little Frenchman is right. You know he is right as well as I do. Those things are over. We kings and rulers and representatives, have been at the very heart of the mischief. Of course we imply separation, and of course separation means the threat of war, and of course the threat of war means the accumulation of more and more atomic bombs. The old game's up. But, I say, we mustn't stand here, you know. The world waits. Don't you think the old game's up, Firmin?" Firmin adjusted a strap, passed a hand over his wet forehead, and followed earnestly. "I admit, sir," he said to a receding back, "that there has to be some sort of hegemony, some sort of amphictyonic council. There's got to be one simple government for all the world," said the king over his shoulder. "But as for a reckless, unqualified abandonment, sir—" "Bang!" cried the king. Firmin made no answer to this interruption, but a faint shadow of annoyance passed across his heated features. "Yesterday," said the king, by way of explanation, "the Japanese very nearly got San Francisco." "I hadn't heard, sir." "The Americans ran the Japanese airplane down into the sea, and there the bomb got busted." "Under the sea, sir?" "Yes, submarine volcano. The steam is in sight of the Californian coast. It was as near as that. And with things like this happening, you want me to go up this hill and haggle. Consider the effect of that on my imperial cousin, and all the others." "He will haggle, sir." "Not a bit of it," said the king. "But, sir—" "Leblanc won't let him." Firmin halted abruptly and gave a vicious pull at the offending strap. "Sir, he will listen to his advisers," he said, in a tone that in some subtle way seemed to implicate his master with the trouble of the knapsack. The king considered him. "We will go just a little higher," he said. "I want to find this unoccupied village they spoke of, and then we will drink that beer. It can't be far. We will drink the beer and throw away the bottles. And then, Firmin, I shall ask you to look at things in a more generous light, because, you know, you must." He turned about, and for some time the only sound they made was the noise of their boots upon the loose stones of the way and the irregular breathing of Firmin. At length, as it seemed to Firmin, or quite soon, as it seemed to the king, the gradient of the path diminished, the way widened out, and they found themselves in a very beautiful place indeed. It was one of those upland clusters of sheds and houses that are still to be found in the mountains of North Italy, buildings that were used only in the high summer, and which it was the custom to leave locked up and deserted through all the winter and spring, and up to the middle of June. The buildings were of a soft-toned gray stone, buried in rich green grass, shadowed by chestnut trees, and lit by an extraordinary blaze of yellow broom. Never had the king seen broom so glorious. He shouted at the light of it, for it seemed to give out more sunlight even than it received. He sat down impulsively on a lichenous stone, tugged out his bread and cheese, and bade Firmin thrust the beer into the shaded weeds to cool. "The things people miss, Firmin," he said, "who go up into the air in ships." Firmin looked around him with an ungenial eye. "You see it at its best, sir," he said, "before the peasants come here again and make it filthy." "It would be beautiful anyhow," said the king. "Superficially, sir," said Firmin, "but it stands for a social order that is fast vanishing away. Indeed, judging by the grass between the stones and in the huts, I am inclined to doubt if it is in use even now." "I suppose," said the king, "that they would come up immediately the hay on this flower meadow is cut. It would be those slow, creamy-colored beasts, I expect, one sees on the roads below, and swarthy girls with red handkerchiefs over their black hair. It is wonderful to think how long that beautiful old life lasted. In the Roman times and long ages before ever the rumor of the Romans had come into these parts, men drove their cattle up into the places, as the summer came on. How haunted is this place! There have been quarrels here, hopes. Children have played here and lived to be old cronies and old gaffers, and died. And so it has gone on for thousands of lives. Lovers, innumerable lovers, have caressed amidst this golden broom." He meditated over a busy mouthful of bread and cheese. "We ought to have brought a tankard for that beer," he said. Firmin produced a folding aluminum cup, and the king was pleased to drink. "I wish, sir," said Firmin suddenly, "I could induce you at least to delay your decision." "It's no good talking, Firmin," said the king. "My mind's as clear as daylight." "Sire," protested Firmin, with his voice full of bread and cheese and genuine emotion, "have you no respect for your kingship?" The king paused before he answered with unwonted gravity. "It's just because I have, Firmin, that I won't be a puppet in this game of international politics." He regarded his companion for a moment, and then remarked, "Kingship! What do you know of kingship, Firmin?" "Yes," cried the king to his astonished counselor, "for the first time in my life I am going to be a king. I am going to lead, and lead by my own authority. For a dozen generations my family has been a set of dummies in the hands of their advisers. Advisers! Now I am going to be a real king, and I am going to abolish, dispose of, finish the crown to which I have been a slave. But what a world of paralyzing shams this roaring stuff has ended! The rigid old world is in the melting pot again, and I, who seem to be no more than the stuffing inside a regal robe, I am a king among kings. I have to play my part at the head of things, and put an end to blood and fire and idiot disorder." "But, sir," protested Firmin, "this man Leblanc is right. The whole world has got to be a republic, one and indivisible. You know that, and my duty is to make that easy. A king should lead his people. You want me to stick on their backs like some old man of the sea. Today must be a sacrament of kings. Our trust for mankind is done with and ended. We must part our robes among them. We must part our kingship among them, and say to them all, now the king and everyone must rule the world. Have you no sense of the magnificence of this occasion? You want me, Firmin? You want me to go up there and haggle like a damn little solicitor for some price, some compensation, some qualification?" Fearman shrugged his shoulders, and assumed an expression of despair. Meanwhile he conveyed, "One must eat." For a time neither spoke, and the king ate and turned over in his mind the phrases of speech he intended to make to the conference. By virtue of the antiquity of his crown, he was to preside, and he intended to make his presidency memorable. Reassured of his eloquence, he considered the despondent and sulky Fearman for a space. "Fearman," he said, "you have idealed kingship." "It has been my dream, sir," said Fearman sorrowfully, "to serve." "At the levers, Fearman," said the king. "You are pleased to be unjust," said Fearman, deeply hurt. "I am pleased to be getting out of it," said the king. "Oh, Fearman," he went on, "have you no thought for me? Will you never realize that I am not only flesh and blood, but imagination, with its rights? I am a king in revolt against that fetter they put upon my head. I am a king awake. My reverend grandparents never in all their august lives had a waking moment. They loved the job that you, your advisers, gave them. They never had a doubt of it. It was like giving a doll to a woman who ought to have a child. They delighted in processions and opening things and being read addresses to, and visiting triplets and nonagenarians and all that sort of thing. Incredibly. They used to keep albums of cuttings from all the illustrated papers showing them at it, and if the press cutting partials grew thin, they were worried. It was all that ever worried them. But there is something atavistic in me. I hark back to unconstitutional monarchs. They christened me too retrogressively, I think. I wanted to get things done. I was bored. I might have fallen into vice. Most intelligent and energetic princes do. But the palace precautions were unusually thorough. I was brought up in the purest court the world has ever seen, alertly pure. So I read books, Fearman, and went about asking questions. The thing was bound to happen to one of us sooner or later, perhaps two. Very likely I am not vicious. I don't think I am. He reflected. "No," he said. Fearman cleared his throat. "I don't think you are, sir," he said. "You prefer—" He stopped short. He had been going to say talking. He substituted ideas. "That world of royalty," the king went on. "In a little while no one will understand it any more. It will become a riddle. Among other things, it was a world of perpetual best clothes. Everything was in its best clothes for us, and usually wearing bunting, with a cinema watching to see we took it properly. If you are a king, Firmin, and you go and look at a regiment, it instantly stops whenever it is doing, changes into full uniform and presents arms. When my august parents went in a train, the coal in the tender used to be whitened. It did, Firmin, and if coal had been white instead of black, I have no doubt the authorities would have blackened it. That was the spirit of our treatment. People were always walking about with their faces to us. One never saw anything in profile. One got an impression of a world that was insanely focused on ourselves. And when I began to poke my little questions into the Lord Chancellor and the Archbishop and all the rest of them, about what I should see if people turned round, the general effect I produced was that I wasn't by any means displaying the royal tact they had expected of me." He meditated for a time. "And yet, you know, there is something in the kingship, Firmin. It stiffened up my august little grandfather. It gave my grandmother a kind of awkward dignity even when she was cross, and she was very often cross. They both had a profound sense of responsibility. My poor father's health was wretched during his brief career. Nobody outside the circle knows just how he screwed himself up to things. My people expect it, he used to say of this tiresome duty or that. Most of the things they made him do were silly. It was part of a bad tradition. But there was nothing silly in the way he set about them. The spirit of kingship is a fine thing, Fearman. I feel it in my bones. I do not know what I might not be if I were not a king. I could die for my people, Fearman, and you couldn't. No, don't say you could die for me, because I know better. Don't think I forget my kingship, Fearman. Don't imagine that. I am a king, a kingly king, by right divine. The fact that I am also a chattering young man makes not the slightest difference to that. But the proper textbook for kings, Fearman, is none of the court memoirs and Welt politic books you would have had me read. It is the old Fraser's Golden Bough. Have you read that, Fearman? Fearman had. Those were the authentic kings. In the end they were cut up and a bit given to everybody. They sprinkled the nations with kingship. Fearman turned himself round and faced his royal master. "What do you intend to do, sir?" he asked. "If you will not listen to me, what do you propose to do this afternoon?" The king flicked crumbs from his coat. "Manifestly war has to stop forever, Fearman. Manifestly this can only be done by putting all the world under one government. Our crowns and flags are in the way. Manifestly they must go." "Yes, sir," interrupted Fearman. "But what government? I don't see what government you get by a universal abdication." "Well," said the king, with his hands about his knees, "we shall be the government." "The conference?" exclaimed Fearman. "Who else?" asked the king simply. "It's perfectly simple," he added to Fearman's tremendous silence. "But," cried Fearman, "you must have sanctions. Will there be no form of election, for example?" "Why should there be?" asked the king, with intelligent curiosity. "The consent of the governed." "Fearman, we are just going to lay down our differences and take over government, without any election at all, without any sanction. The governed will show their consent by silence. If any effective opposition arises, we shall ask it to come in and help. The true sanction of kingship is the grip upon the scepter. We aren't going to worry people to vote for us. I'm certain the mass of men does not want to be bothered with such things. We'll contrive a way for anyone interested to join in. That's quite enough in the way of democracy. Perhaps later, when things don't matter, we shall govern all right, Fearman. Government only becomes difficult when the lawyers get hold of it, and since these troubles began the lawyers are shy. Indeed, come to think of it, I wonder where all the lawyers are. Where are they? A lot, of course, were bagged, some of the worst ones, when they blew up my legislature. You never knew the late Lord Chancellor. Necessities bury rights, and create them. Lawyers live on dead rights disinterred. We've done with that way of living. We don't have more law than a code can cover, and beyond that, government will be free. Before the sun sets today, Fearman, trust me, we shall have made our abdications, all of us, and declared the world republic, supreme and indivisible. I wonder what my august grandmother would have made of it, all my rights, and then we shall go on governing. What else is there to do? All over the world we shall declare that there is no longer mine or thine, but ours. China, the United States, 2/3 of Europe, will certainly fall in and obey. They will have to do so. What else can they do? Their official rulers are here with us. they won't be able to get together any sort of idea of not obeying us. Then we shall declare that every sort of property is held in trust for the Republic." "But, sir," cried Firmin, suddenly enlightened, "has this been arranged already?" "My dear Firmin, do you think we have come here, all of us, to talk at large? The talking has been done for half a century, talking and writing. We are here to set the new thing, the simple, obvious, necessary thing going." He stood up. Firmin, forgetting the habits of a score of years, remained seated. "Well," he said at last, "and I have known nothing." The king smiled cheerfully. He liked these walks with Firmin. Section 3. That conference upon the Brissago meadows was one of the most heterogeneous collections of prominent people that has ever met together. Principalities and powers, stripped and shadowed until all their pride and mystery were gone, met in a marvelous new humility. Here were kings and emperors whose capitals were lakes of flaming destruction, statesmen whose countries had become chaos, scared politicians and financial potentates. Here were leaders of thought and learned investigators dragged reluctantly to the control of affairs. Altogether there were 93 of them, Leblanc's conception of the head men of the world. They had all come to the realization of the simple truths that the indefatigable Leblanc had hammered into them, and, drawing his resources from the King of Italy, he had provisioned his conference with a generous simplicity quite in accordance with the rest of his character, and so at last was able to make his astonishing and entirely rational appeal. He had appointed King Egbert the President. He believed in this young man so firmly that he completely dominated him, and he spoke himself as a secretary might speak from the President's left hand, and evidently did not realize himself that he was telling them all exactly what they had to do. He imagined he was merely recapitulating the obvious features of the situation for their convenience. He was dressed in ill-fitting white silk clothes, and he consulted a dingy little packet of notes as he spoke. They put him out. He explained that he had never spoken from notes before, but that this occasion was exceptional. And then King Egbert spoke as he was expected to speak, and Leblanc's spectacles moistened at that flow of generous sentiment, most amiably and lightly expressed. "We haven't to stand on ceremony," said the king. "We have to govern the world. We have always pretended to govern the world, and here is our opportunity." "Of course," whispered Leblanc, nodding his head rapidly. "Of course." "The world has been smashed up, and we have to put it on its wheels again," said King Egbert. "And it is the simple common sense of this crisis for all to help and none to seek advantage. Is that our tone or not?" The gathering was too old and seasoned and miscellaneous for any great displays of enthusiasm, but that was its tone, and with an astonishment that somehow became exhilarating it began to resign, repudiate, and declare its intentions. Firmin, taking notes behind his master, heard everything that had been foretold among the yellow broom come true. With a queer feeling that he was dreaming, he assisted at the proclamation of the world state, and saw the message taken out to the wireless operators to be throbbed all round the habitable globe. "And next," said King Egbert, with a cheerful excitement in his voice, "we have to get every atom of Carolinum, and all the plant for making it, into our control." Firmin was not alone in his incredulity. Not a man there who was not a very amiable, reasonable, benevolent creature at bottom. Some had been born to power, and some had happened upon it. Some had struggled to get it, not clearly knowing what it was and what it implied, but none was irreconcilably set upon its retention at the price of cosmic disaster. Their minds had been prepared by circumstances and sedulously cultivated by Leblanc, and now they took the broad, obvious road along which King Egbert was leading them, with a mingled conviction of strangeness and necessity. Things went very smoothly. The King of Italy explained the arrangements that had been made for the protection of the camp from any fantastic attack. A couple of thousand of aeroplanes, each carrying a sharpshooter, guarded them, and there was an excellent system of relays, and at night all the sky would be searched by scores of lights, and the admirable Leblanc gave luminous reasons for their camping just where they were, and going on with their administrative duties forthwith. He knew of this place, because he had happened upon it when holiday making with Madame Leblanc 20 years and more ago. "There is very simple fare at present," he explained, "on account of the disturbed state of the countries about us, but we have excellent fresh milk, good red wine, beef, bread, salad, and lemons. In a few days I hope to place things in the hands of a more efficient caterer." The members of the New World Government dined at 3 long tables on trestles, and down the middle of these tables Leblanc, in spite of the barrenness of his menu, had contrived to have a great multitude of beautiful roses. There was a similar accommodation for the secretaries and attendants at a lower level down the mountain. The assembly dined as it had debated, in the open air, and over the dark crags to the west the glowing June sunset shone upon the banquet. There was no precedency now among the 93, and King Egbert found himself between a pleasant little Japanese stranger in spectacles and his cousin of Central Europe, and opposite a great Bengali leader and the President of the United States of America. Beyond the Japanese was Holston, the old chemist, and Leblanc was a little way down the other side. The King was cheerfully talkative and abounded in ideas. He fell presently into an amiable controversy with the American, who seemed to feel a lack of impressiveness in the occasion. It was ever the transatlantic tendency, due, no doubt, to the necessity of handling public questions in a bulky and striking manner, to overemphasize and overaccentuate, and the President was touched by his national failing. He suggested now that there should be a new era, starting from that day as the first day of the first year. The King demurred. "From this day forth, sir, man enters upon his heritage," said the American. "Man," said the King, "is always entering upon his heritage. You Americans have a peculiar weakness for anniversaries, if you will forgive me saying so. Yes, I accuse you of a lust for dramatic effect. Everything is happening always, but you want to say this or this is the real instant in time, and subordinate all the others to it." The American said something about an epoch-making day. "But surely," said the King, "you don't want us to condemn all humanity to a worldwide annual 4th of July forever and evermore, on account of this harmless necessary day of declarations. No conceivable day could ever deserve that. Ah! You do not know, as I do, the devastations of the memorable. My poor grandparents were rubricated. The worst of these huge celebrations is that they break up the dignified succession of one's contemporary emotions. They interrupt, they set back. Suddenly out come the flags and fireworks, and the old enthusiasms are furbished up, and it's sheer destruction of the proper thing that ought to be going on. Sufficient unto the day is the celebration thereof. Let the dead past bury its dead. You see, in regard to the calendar, I am for democracy, and you are for aristocracy. All things I hold are august, and I have a right to be lived through on their merits. No day should be sacrificed on the grave of departed events. What do you think of it, Wilhelm? For the noble, yes. All days should be noble. Exactly my position, said the king, and felt pleased at what he had been saying. And then, since the American pressed his idea, the king contrived to shift the talk from the question of celebrating the epoch they were making to the question of the probabilities that lay ahead. Here everyone became diffident. They could see the world unified and at peace, but what detail was to follow from that unification they seemed indisposed to discuss. This diffidence struck the king as remarkable. He plunged upon the possibilities of science. All the huge expenditure that had hitherto gone into unproductive naval and military preparations must now, he declared, place research upon new footing. Where one man worked we will have 1,000, he appealed to Holston. We have only begun to peep into these possibilities, he said. You at any rate have sounded the vaults of the treasure house. They are unfathomable, smiled Holston. Man, said the American, with a manifest resolve to justify and reinstate himself after the flickering contradictions of the king, man, I say, is only beginning to enter upon his heritage. Tell us some of the things you believe we shall presently learn. Give us an idea of the things we may presently do, said the king to Holston. Holston opened out the visas. Science, the king cried presently, is the new king of the world. Our view, said the president, is that sovereignty resides with the people. No, said the king, the sovereign is a being more subtle than that, and less arithmetical. Neither my family nor your emancipated people. It is something that floats about us, and above us, and through us. It is that common impersonal will and sense of necessity, of which science is the best understood and most typical aspect. It is the mind of the race. It is that which brought us here, which has bowed us all to its demands. He paused and glanced down the table at Leblanc, and then reopened at his former antagonist. There is a disposition, said the king, to regard this gathering as if it were actually doing what it appears to be doing, as if we 90-odd men of our own free will and wisdom were unifying the world. There is a temptation to consider ourselves exceptionally fine fellows, and masterful men, and all the rest of it. We are not. I doubt if we should average out as anything abler than any other casually selected body of 90-odd men. We are no creators. We are consequences. We are salvagers, or salvagees. The thing today is not ourselves, but the wind of conviction that has blown us hither. The American had to confess he could hardly agree with the king's estimate of their average. Holster, perhaps, and one or two others, might lift us a little, the king conceded. But the rest of us? His eyes flitted once more towards Leblanc. Look at Leblanc, he said. He's just a simple soul. There are hundreds and thousands like him. I admit a certain dexterity, a certain lucidity, but there is not a country town in France where there is not a Leblanc or so to be found about 2 o'clock in its principal cafe. It's just that he isn't complicated or supermanish, or any of those things that has made all he has done possible. But in happier times, don't you think, Wilhelm, he would have remained just what his father was, a successful epicier, very clean, very accurate, very honest, and on holidays he would have gone out with Madame Leblanc and her knitting in a punt with a jar of something gentle, and have sat under a large, reasonable, green-lined umbrella, and fished very nearly and successfully for gudgeon. The President and the Japanese Prince in spectacles protested together. "If I do him an injustice," said the King, "it is only because I want to elucidate my argument. I want to make it clear how small are men and days, and how great is man in comparison." Section 4. So it was King Egbert talked at Brissago after they had proclaimed the unity of the world. Every evening after that, the assembly dined together and talked at their ease, and grew accustomed to each other and sharpened each other's ideas. And every day they worked together, and really for a time believed they were inventing a new government for the world. They discussed a constitution. But there were matters needing attention too urgently to wait for any constitution. They attended to these incidentally. The constitution it was that waited. It was presently found convenient to keep the constitution waiting indefinitely, as King Egbert had foreseen, and meanwhile, with an increasing self-confidence, that council went on governing. On this first evening of all the council's gatherings, after King Egbert had talked for a long time, and drunken and praised very abundantly the simple red wine of the country that Leblanc had procured for them, he fathered about him a group of congenial spirits, and fell into a discourse upon simplicity, praising it above all things, and declaring that the ultimate aim of art, religion, philosophy, and science alike was to simplify. He instanced himself as a devotee to simplicity, and Leblanc he instanced as a crowning instance of the splendor of this quality. Upon that they all agreed. When at last the company about the tables broke up, the King found himself brimming over with a peculiar affection and admiration for Leblanc. He made his way to him and drew him aside, and broached what he declared was a small matter. There was, he said, a certain order in his gift that, unlike all the other orders and decorations in the world, had never been corrupted. It was reserved for elderly men of supreme distinction, the acuteness of whose gifts was already touched to mellowness, and it had included the greatest names of every age, so far as the advisers of his family had been to ascertain them. At present, the King admitted, these matters of stars and badges were rather obscured by more urgent affairs. For his own part, he had never set any value upon them at all. But a time might come, when they would be at last interesting, and in short, he wished to confer the Order of Merit upon Leblanc. His sole motive in doing so, he added, was his strong desire to signalize his personal esteem. He laid his hand upon the Frenchman's shoulder as he said these things, with an almost brotherly affection. Leblanc received this proposal with a modest confusion that greatly enhanced the King's opinion of his admirable simplicity. He pointed out that eager as he was to snatch at the proffered distinction, it might at the present stage appear invidious, and he therefore suggested that the conferring of it should be postponed, until it could be made the crown and conclusion of his services. The King was unable to shake this resolution, and the two men parted with expressions of mutual esteem. The King then summoned Firmin in order to make a short note of a number of things that he had said during the day, but after about 20 minutes' work, The sweet sleepiness of the mountain air overcame him, and he dismissed Firmin and went to bed and fell asleep at once, and slept with extreme satisfaction. He had an active, agreeable day. Section 5. The establishment of the new order that was thus so humanly begun, was, if one measures it by the standard of any preceding age, a rapid progress. The fighting spirit of the world was exhausted. Only here or there did fierceness linger. For long decades the combative side in human affairs had been monstrously exaggerated by the accidents of political separation. This now became luminously plain. An enormous proportion of the force that sustained armaments had been nothing more aggressive than the fear of war and warlike neighbors. It is doubtful if any large section of the men actually enlisted for fighting ever at any time really hungered and thirsted for bloodshed and danger. That kind of appetite was probably never very strong in the species after the savage stage was past. The army was a profession, in which killing had become a disagreeable possibility, rather than an eventful certainty. If one reads the old newspapers and periodicals of that time, which did so much to keep militarism alive, one finds very little about glory and adventure, and a constant harping on the disagreeableness of invasion and subjugation. In one word, militarism was funk. The belligerent resolution of the armed Europe of the 20th century was the resolution of a fiercely frightened sheep to plunge. And now that its weapons were exploding in its hands, Europe was only too eager to drop them, and abandon this fancied refuge of violence. For a time the whole world had been shocked into frankness. Nearly all the clever people who had hitherto sustained the ancient belligerent separations had now been brought to realize the need for simplicity of attitude and openness of mind. And in this atmosphere of moral renaissance, there was little attempt to get negotiable advantages out of resistance to the new order. Human beings are foolish enough to doubt, but few have stopped to haggle in a fire escape. The council had its way with them. The band of "patriots" who seized the laboratories and arsenal just outside Osaka, and tried to rouse Japan to revolt against inclusion in the Republic of Mankind, found they had miscalculated the national pride, and met the swift vengeance of their own countrymen. That fight in the arsenal was a vivid incident in this closing chapter of the history of war. To the last the "patriots" were undecided whether, in the event of a defeat, they would explode their supply of atomic bombs or not. They were fighting with swords outside the iridium doors, and the moderates of their number were at bay and on the verge of destruction. Only 10, indeed, remained unwounded when the Republicans burst in to the rescue.